All right, team, let's get started. Today we're gonna do waveforms from the world, and we're really lucky to have input from. I get emails and images sent from different people, which is really good because we get to see different ventilators that we not always have the ability to do. So let's learn together. So today's June 29th, 2021, and this is SEVA VentRounds. Disclosures, we discuss particulars of ventilator modes. There's no endorsement of any particular mode, manufacturer, or company. Whatever we say, it's our opinion, and it doesn't represent the Cleveland Clinic opinion at all. There's my conflicts of interest, and Rob Chatburn, we both are the directors of this activity. And some ground rules, this is a recorded session, so keep your microphone muted, because if not, we get all the ambient noise. We may call upon you to comment, and please then unmute and let us know what you feel. This is a pretty safe environment. We want to learn all together. So have no shyness on asking, even if you think that it's the most obvious question in the world. That's how we have found some of the most amazing things on these ventilator waveforms. There's the chat function, so use it at will. And we also use a WebEx poll to elicit some of the audience interactions that we want to have there. And we may or may not activate it depending on, oh no, yes, I can do it today. Excellent. So we'll activate it as it comes. And if you're a Cleveland Clinic employee, you get CME, and we're working on getting CMEs for our RTs too that are connecting to these. All righty. So I don't know if Angelo Roncalli is on the line. I don't see him, so we're gonna wait and come back to this one. This is one that came in Twitter yesterday, created a lot of fuss, and we're gonna come back and review it. But Ariel is on the line, so I thought that we would start with this one. This is a classic image in mechanical ventilation, and so I'm gonna open the poll, and you'll be able now to answer what you see on this image. And so get at it, whatever you think, have no fear, and you're gonna have 3 minutes to answer this. And I see a couple of our fellows on the line, and I'll probably invite Samit to talk. Not yet, Samit. Let's have the poll answer. There's still 15 people answering it. And this one was evidently a courtesy from Ariel Garnero, who's one of the respiratory therapists, and he has contributed to the literature a fair amount. So thank you, Ariel, for sharing this image with us today. Great job. And I know that some of these questions you're like, what is he talking about? This is the first time we do it. We'll walk you through it. Don't you worry. Very good. All right. 30 seconds more. There we go. So it's gonna close now. Samid, do you want to me to share the polling results first or at the end?
Well, either way, I'm okay if the audience wants to see the results. That's fine.
All right, so let me share them the polling results, and then you'll get at it. Okay.
Okay.
Excellent. So apply. So now you should be able to see them. I'm putting them on my screen, and I hope this is sharing appropriately. Five of you thought that this was pressure control CMB set point. A number of you recognize this as PC CMBA, so adaptive targeting. I left here the mode on the top so that we could that could give a hint. In terms of the load, there was an even split between resistive load and PMOS. So Samit, you'll have to comment between PMOS and resistive load, and there may be both of them there, but we want to hear from you. And then in terms of the interactions, the trigger was felt to be normal. The majority of people, there were some that called this early trigger. In terms of inspiration, majority thought this was normal or some work shifting. And in terms of cycle, there was some features of early cycle read by 2 people, and the rest were like, what the hell are you talking about? And then expiratory work, the majority of people felt that this was expiratory work. So, alrighty. It's your turn, Samit.
Thank you, Dr. Mireles. I think the
No, thank
tag
you
is,
for contributing. Go ahead.
so first of all, I'm walking, so if you hear some weird noises, please excuse me. I think the tag is VC CMBA. And the reason I chose, sorry, PC, I said PC CMBA. And the reason I chose that is if you look at the pressure waveform, it looks like pressure control. Also looking at the flow waveform, it is in line with pressure control. And then there's a breath-to-breath variation in how the flow modulates, especially how it's like changing the height of the pressure curve from breath to breath. So that's why I think it's adaptive. Also, it's given away on the top, so that's how. In terms of load, it's difficult to say, but I think in inspiration there's some form of like a elastic load, and it's just the time constant being a little bit shorter, but then it changes from the next breath. So really challenging one, but I would call it like either it's passive breath. The machine, the breath has been triggered and cycled by the machine. I don't see any line that would indicate that the patient is triggering the breath. So PMOS, I know the waves are not ideal, but PMOS could be there, but I don't see any patient initiated breath. So I would say inspiratory and expiratory PMOS mainly, but there is a time constants difference between inspiration and expiration, and I wonder is it set this way by the machine or is it just how the patient is behaving? In terms of trigger, I think the trigger is normal. I see all 4 breaths are machine triggered. There is no discordance there. In terms of inspiration, I see a little bit of an inspiratory work shifting. Um,
What about cycle?
it gets adjusted to, like maybe the machine adjusted due to the adaptive algorithm and whatnot. Cycle-wise, I see that extra flow.
You're getting cut.
Now that could be just early. Can you hear me, Dr. Morales?
Yeah, now I can.
So in terms of cycling, I think there's that blip in the expiratory phase, which shows that the inspiratory effort is still there, or the patient is trying to force exhale. But I think the
Samir,
patient might be on a nebulized. Can you hear me? Hello?
yeah, you're getting cut. So why don't you say, is it normal, early, or late?
I think the cycling is normal, and the blip we see in expiration is because of nebulization. And the expiratory work shifting we see is because for the same reason. That the patient, either there's external flow or the patient is supposed to be exhaling against nebulizer, so that could explain the split. That's what I think is going on.
Right, so let's go in order for this. Rob, are you on? Yes. Alrighty. So in terms of the tag, for those of you that are new to this way of doing it, what we do is we change the name of the ventilator, because every ventilator has different names, commercial names for a mode, and we convert it into a tag. And what this means is that the breaths are pressure control, that all are continuous mandatory ventilation. So all the breaths are mandatory. So that means that they are triggered or cycled by the ventilator, and which is the case here. They're all triggered. So that means that they're mandatory. And adaptive means that the caregiver sets the tidal volume. Here they set the tidal volume, and the machine, this is a target, not the absolute that the patient will receive, and the machine will move up and down the inspiratory pressure to achieve that target. That's why it's called adaptive. So I think that you're 100% correct here. In terms of what is the load, here is where you have to look at different waveforms, Samir, when we're going through this. So in the first waveform, you have pressure control, and you see that the normal decay of a waveform should look like this, right? And instead of looking like this, it looks like during this, the inspiratory time was set probably around 0.7, based on what I can see, 0.7 seconds. And during those 0.7 seconds, this waveform didn't reach the baseline. Actually, it has a little hump here, but here, it's definitely different than the others. You can see that this one should look like that, sorry, like that, just to mimic the other ones that are pretty similar. So, and then when I come and look at the expiratory waveform, if we avoid this little deflection, it looks like it's going, it's a nice exponential decay. So this makes me think that the flow is not getting there. So the concern is that this is a resistive load with some PMOS on top of it. So this is PMOS and this is PMOS, meaning patient effort. So when I see this, I say, well, is this resistive component that it's increased, which is potentially the case, or it is because the respiratory rate is set so fast that you're not allowing the patient to exhale at enough time. Before we go into PV discordance, Rob, any disagreements, comments on this?
Nope, that looks good so far.
Excellent. So far we have that this is pressure control CMB, adaptive targeting with features of increased resistance in both inspiratory and expiratory, and the presence of PMOS during inspiration and actually expiration. So now that I have told you that, Samir, let's look at this again. So you said the trigger looks normal. And actually, I agree with you. The trigger is triggered by the machine. It looks beautiful. There is no hint that this is the patient triggering it. However, you have the trigger, and followed by that, you have PMOS. So what's the name of that?
Is it early cycling or reverse triggering?
Early trigger, Samir.
Okay.
So this is early trigger. This is what you're seeing here. Whenever you have this means that there was early trigger. And actually you have features. Whenever you see early trigger, many times you're going to see also features of early cycle, which you were talking about over here. You mentioned it and then you recanted, but you saw this little hump over here. And this makes you think that in the presence of PMOS at the end of the breath and presence of PMOS in early expiration, that means that the patient was doing effort from here to here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that makes sense.
Excellent. So that's the early trigger, and actually that takes us to so during inspiration there's perhaps a little bit of work shifting. The rest you really don't see anything. It does affect the size of the tidal volume whenever. So actually you can see it here. There was PMOS. And because there was PMOS, the tidal volume here is larger than over here, because the PMOS fell right into the end of the still during inspiration. That's why you see it larger. Now, Normally, when I see this, I would say, "Oh, what is this? Is this a missed trigger or failed trigger, or what? Or is it a floppy airway or something like that?" But you see this little humpy here. There's a little hint that tells you that there. Let me make it bigger for all of you on the phone, so you can see here that little change there. That makes me think that this patient was having reverse trigger, but it's pretty late after the hit. And so I don't see expiratory work. I see inspiratory work during expiration that is part of this combination of early trigger that leads to early cycle. The presence of a nebulizer usually will give you positive flow because you're putting air inside the circuit rather than negative flow. That would be, unless it's on the, well, actually, if it's increasing the flow overall, it would look like this. But I would expect other changes here on the volume and whatnot. So this is the feature in general. Comments, questions from the group? Rob?
Yeah, Eduardo, if you look at the very last expiration,
Yes.
you
Oh,
note that the peak flow is much higher and there's no distortion. So that confirms everything that you just said.
oh, that's a wonderful observation. Thank you, Rob. Yes. Look at that. When there was no PMOS and it didn't subtract from the expiratory flow, and it's much higher. Outstanding observation. So this is what we call a reverse, what it's called in the literature as a reverse trigger. We have stopped calling it a reverse trigger and we call it early trigger, because reverse trigger in the way that it's interpreted, it means that the trigger from the machine triggered the next breath. And it seems to us that there are still many physiopathological etiologies for this that are not entirely clear to the world. And to that, I chose to show this article over here, and I would ask you to read this. This is a great work from Boston with Dr. Bedorf, Cassis, Talmor, Loring, who's really good at lung physiology. And they describe 4 types of reverse trigger. And so what you see here is actually, this is the esophageal pressure, this is the volume, this is the airway pressure on the ventilator, the flow of the ventilator, and this is the transpulmonary pressure, the pressure on the lung. And so what you can see here, what I would point, they call this mild reverse trigger, in which you can see the patient doing an effort, but it occurs late on the breath, and you can see that little peak that happens, and the early cycle, the waveform looks like early cycle here. They also mentioned this late reverse trigger, and what you see here on this late trigger is actually it's identical to our patient. You see the airway pressure doesn't have much change. The flow has that little peak that I showed you over here, and then you see that image that looks like an early cycle in the expiratory loop. So all of these characteristic of what they call a reverse trigger. You can see it more clear on this other waveform. So this early trigger equals reverse trigger in any way. So, alrighty, there's a couple of questions here, Rob. So let's try to get at them. The first one is, I didn't understand why the bump in the expiratory flow is not a false trigger. You mean a failed trigger, Hara? Yes, that if we didn't know what we know now, I would have called this a failed trigger. If you eliminate the first breath, I would have probably said that this was a failed trigger on this patient, and with the presence of increased resistance, that's what I would have said. That's the key of looking at these waveforms. And actually, if you start thinking about them, each breath has a clue for the next one, and you want consistency, and some of them have a little bit and a little bit more. So because of the first breath, Hara, that makes me think that what we're seeing is just reverse trigger, that it's a late early trigger or late reverse trigger, depending how you want to name it, but it's the exact same thing. The next question is from Tamer Hudali. He says, the tidal volume curve doesn't reset to baseline, and that usually indicates a leak in the circuit. Yes, does reset. Could that play a role in early triggering? So that's a great point, Tamer. Usually when this resets down to 0, that means to us that there's a leak, and certainly this patient could have a leak. I don't think that it has a role in early trigger. The early trigger means more than the PMOS activates as a reflex from the machine breath, or because there's entrainment of the respiratory rate between the one that is set and the one from the patient, that's the two leading theories that I know of. So I don't think that would necessarily do it. This can also be present in patients that exhale during inspiration, which is not the case in this model. So I would potentially check this patient for the presence of a leak. I think that you're right on that.
I don't think there's a leak, because then you'd have a positive bias in the flow. I think all that's happening is that there is expiratory flow right up until the time the ventilator triggers the next breath. As soon as it triggers the next breath, it automatically resets. So it looks like a leak, but it's not because of a leak. It's because you have continuous expiratory flow.
Oh, that's a great point. So yeah, the patient has not finished emptying his air trapping. Perfect.
Right.
It says in this Udi asked us, in this patient with early trigger, would you reduce sedation or reduce respiratory rate, or both? Had a patient like this recently, thanks. That's a great question. So usually what I do when I see this is to think of reducing the respiratory rate. That's my first attempt to let the patient respiratory rate go and drive the exchange. In some patients, they are acidotic and you cannot do it, but in others, it does work. In terms of reducing the sedation, again, if I can, I think that a patient that is awake is better than not. So I will always try to do that in general, unless I cannot do that. Ariel asks us, can we say that the patient is actively participating in the breath, or just passively when his PMOS is triggered by the vent? Good question. Well, he's actively participating in the breath. He's performing some amount of work. Just the presence of his PMOS does some work. Now, is that effective and efficient for him? Not necessarily. That's Rob, thoughts?
Exactly what I would have said. If there's a positive PMOS, it's an active breath to some degree.
All righty. Great this question. This was a really cool case. I don't see Angelo in the call yet, so we're gonna do another one and then we'll go back to the other one. So this is also from Ariel. He had a good set of questions sent out to us. So let me put the poll up now that you know how this goes. Somebody, thank you. That was. Here comes the poll. Alrighty, go at it. So this is a common case that we see with this type of ventilator, and actually it happens on others, and you'll see today we have another beautiful example. Marcos, I'm not gonna let you annotate because it creates something in the screen, so it's not lack of desire, it's just we cannot do that. And as people are answering, is there one of our fellows that wants to give it a try? No. Have no fear. We're learning together. Mariam, are you in a condition that you can read this one? Okay, Thint, I'm gonna give this one to you. I know you can read this one. We're almost there with the time. Keep going at your leisure. We have 30 seconds more. Five seconds. All right. Man, do you want to see the results or not? It seems everybody has a muted phone. So let me go over the results and then I'll read it myself. So what is the mode? The majority of you chose volume control. Some of you chose VC, IMB, DD. One of you, there's one for each actually, almost. But the highest score was for volume control CMBS. What is the load? There's PMOS was the main answer from everybody. There was one resistive issue. In terms of trigger, it was felt that it was normal by majority. There was one failed or missed trigger read during inspiration. There is work shifting severe by majority of the people. And then in terms of cycle, late cycle in a couple of the reads, and then expiratory work was the main answer. Very good. All righty, so let's get at it. I don't know, Aman or Mario, did you unmute? If you can't, I will. All righty, I'll do it. All right, so let's go. Sorry. So what is the tag for this mode? Is actually this turns out to be volume control. So that's correct. And then it becomes into IMB DD. Now, this is not all the time. It only happens when you press one button that it's under this thing that's called flow adaptation. And it looks something like this inside a little square. And then it has these little dots on top. And that's called flow adaptation. So let's, why do we know that that's it? So there's actually pretty cool images here that helps us identify that. So thank you, Ariel, for sharing this. And I'm gonna come, well, I'll get to it right now. So in essence, we have set a tidal volume, and when you set the tidal volume, the ventilator is essentially telling and in normal passive conditions, the patient would get a square waveform or a descending ramp, depending what you said, but it would get a square waveform. And the patient would get that flow for that amount of inspiratory time. However, in this ventilator, when you press that button, flow adaptation, when it detects, when there's evidence of PMOS above a certain threshold, then it changes the mode from flow to pressure control. And that's why this doesn't look like a square. It should look like a beautiful square like that. And it doesn't look like that. And then, so some modes just do that, and it allows you to have as much tidal volume as you wish you had. I took this image from the manual for the Servo I, which is exactly what that ventilator is. And this is a common, and I'll walk you through this because this will help you understand why the classification changes. So it turns out that, as I said, if you set this patient and the patient is passive, he will get this breath in which the flow is constant. Then in this case, there was an inspiratory pause, and then the patient would exhale, and that's it. So the patient gets what it wants. But if the patient does PMOS and that PMOS overcomes the threshold, which Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 3 centimeters of water, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So if it's above 3 centimeters of water, then the ventilator switches from volume control to pressure control. And once that PMOS ceases to be above that threshold, it goes back to volume control. So you can see how the volume was controlled and then it went out of being controlled. In the next case, it's the same mode with that same button activated. So the PMOS gets activated, but it is a higher amount of effort from the patient, enough that now the tidal volume is higher than what you set. And when it does that, it changes the breath inspiratory time. And so you now can see that this patient, when it goes down below the threshold, if the tidal volume is above what you wanted, boom, it shuts down the breath and you get a longer now inspiratory pause. And the same happened here. You can see how the inspiratory time gets adjusted just to maintain the tidal volume within the range that you set. However, if the patient takes a big enough breath, very high tidal volume, he may overcome the breath and it will shut down based on the patient's characteristics. So from being a mandatory cycle, which was this one, it turns into a patient cycle. So if it was triggered by the patient, and this then becomes a spontaneous breath, which then turns the mode from volume control to intermittent mandatory ventilation. And so now you come to see this breath, and you can now understand the difference in I times that occurs between these three. The difference in I times is ruled by the fact that you set a tidal volume at 400, and this patient was pulling 1,300 cc's of tidal volume. So the machine doesn't shut up. The patient will get as much, but now this is a patient triggered and a patient cycle breath. And so it becomes a spontaneous breath suddenly. So this is a beautiful example of a mode in which you set it as volume control, but because there was a secret button that you pressed, it turns it into BC IMBDD. And that perhaps is totally okay. We don't have anything against that, but you need to know that that's what's happening. Rob?
One thing I would add is there are 4 different kinds of IMV, and this is the 4th kind. First kind of IMV, you always get the mandatory rate you have set. The second kind, the mandatory breaths are suppressed if the spontaneous frequency is higher, and the third kind is mandatory breaths are suppressed if the spontaneous minute ventilation is higher, and the fourth kind is here, the spontaneous breath and the mandatory breath is suppressed if it switches to pressure control and is patient cycled. And in fact, if you read the manual, it actually says that the volume control breath turns into a pressure support breath. That means you put a spontaneous breath between 2 mandatory breaths, which means by definition, you have IMV, it's not CMV anymore. They don't tell you that in the manual, but that's what's happening.
Yeah. So this is great. I mean, this was an eye opener for us when Terry Bolsko and you, Rob, presented this out. This was really great work from both. So what is the load? So if this is being changed by PMOS, and you can see the effort here, this is definitely PMOS. Sorry, PMOS. And during expiration, I cannot really read this waveform because it looks like this patient is breathing in and out really actively. So whoever answered PMOS, you were right on. Great job. In terms of patient ventilator discordance, the trigger, I agree with the reading. It's pretty normal. It's triggering the breath immediately, and it's trying to pressurize right on. I was looking for a false trigger. Somebody mentioned a false trigger, and perhaps not false, failed trigger. Now we're on the false. It's the failed trigger or missed trigger. I'm not entirely sure about this one. It may be that the patient is relaxing or not. Maybe. In terms of work shifting, this is what we call severe work shifting. And actually, it's pretty cool in a sense. The goal of this dual and what the engineers did was to actually avoid severe work shifting. So if you think that if this patient was on volume control, with the amount of effort that the patient is doing, it's probably it would have gone like this, all the way down. And because they put that dual mechanism that changed it to pressure, it maintained it at essentially baseline. This one does drop below the baseline, talking about severe work shifting. And on this one, you can see the same thing. So I do think that there's work shifting, but the mode in this case, actually for this patient, probably it was better than he was on this mode, than he was on just volume control. Otherwise, he would have been fighting that ventilator like crazy, double triggering, hurting himself. In terms of cycle, because it's now patient cycle, you can see how it crosses. There is no pause, perhaps a little pause here. I'm not entirely sure if this is, it seems that it's the way that he's translating, but I would probably call it normal to a little bit of late, unless somebody disagrees with that. And in expiration, there is definitely expiratory work. So a difficult waveform, but it does outline, and now you can see that this patient is in 25% oxygen saturation on 10 of PEEP, and you start wondering, could this patient be breathing on his own and walking around? Comment, Rob?
Well, just one thing, it's important to understand dual targeting, because if a clinician puts a patient in volume control and therefore expects to have control over the tidal volume dosage, they won't. As you can see here, the tidal volume's all over the map. And it's probably excessive, certainly for the second breath, right?
Yep. Absolutely. So and there's different, we're actually going to see in a second, different type of dual targeting. So I'm giving the cake, but you'll learn a little bit about that too. So this dual targeting gets activated by PMOS. This is one of the dual targets that activates from volume to pressure because of PMOS. Any questions from the group? Comments? Okay. All righty. So we're still good. Yeah, we have. Let's go and do one more. This one is from Angelo. I don't know if he joined us. I wish he would, because I wanted to. This is a really interesting. It hit the Twitter and people started getting excited about it. So I tried to improve the waveform as much as I could. I'm gonna say, well, let's do the poll. Let's test the group on it. So I'm gonna put a new poll. Say questions, no. Poll, say open. Make it easier for me. Open poll. Here you go. So the poll is out. Look at this mode. This is a ventilator that this was the first time that I knew that Mindray made ventilators. I was unaware of that. This ventilator comes from Brazil, which is where Angelo Roncalli is, and he posted this image. So it's volume, what it would be, BAC is the mode there. I put exactly as it comes on this on the Twitter feed. Okay. Very good. Have no fear. This is anonymous. Just give it a trial. This helps you read the waveforms in order, test your knowledge. Alrighty. 20 seconds. All right, 3, 2, 1. Alrighty, let me share the poll. So what does it show? Alrighty, now in this one, the group had a strong feeling that this was volume controlled CMBS, fabulous. In terms of the load, the group was more inclined towards elastic, with perhaps some thinking that there was PMOS, some of us thinking that there was resistive load. In terms of the trigger, it was felt that it was normal by the majority, that the inspiration was normal, but there was perhaps some work shifting. There was a kind of a split there. In terms of the cycle, normal for the majority of people, and the expiration was felt to be normal by everybody. Okay, so I'll ask, is there any of our fellows that it's interested on reading this one? All right, so I'll go at it myself. Oh, I see somebody, Mariam?
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't here for the last one. I do know that you called out my name. So I can try reading this one.
Whatever you want. We're happy to.
Okay.
Thank you for joining.
Yes, so it's volume control. I would actually go with I think it's dual targeting because I see the small bumps on the flow chart. So that's why I would go with IMVDD.
Okay.
As for trigger, I really can't tell. There is no change in color. I don't see any dips. So I would say they're machine trigger and they are normal.
Okay.
Cycling, I see the small like inspiratory pauses, but after that, I don't really see any PMAS. So I believe like it's placed by the respiratory therapist probably to increase the mean airway pressure. So I would say the cycle is normal as well. For the load, I think it's mostly resistive. I really don't think that it's resistive or elastic. Because when I see for the expiratory limb, it does come back. I think the load, I don't see any active PMAS, just I think that there is some effort because I see that the volume changes into pressure in the flow charts, which I think is the dual targeting. So maybe there is a little patient effort. So maybe a little PMAS where it's sensing that, and then we have these small bumps in the flow. So yeah, maybe a little PMAS in the inspiratory, but expiratory, I think it's normal.
Do you think there's work shifting?
I don't think there is work shifting in expiration. It does go properly normal. The only thing that I think is there might be a little work shifting on the inspiration is because it's changing from volume control to pressure control because there is bump. So that is what like the dual targeting must be sensed by something. So over there, but I don't see a lot.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you, Mariam. Thank you for volunteering and speaking out today. Very interesting. And so the questions that came. So let's start by the tag. Just by looking at this, Rob, I'm going to ask you to go take a stab at it. I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, there are two clues. First is it does say VAC, so that you can have a clue that it might be volume control. And if you look at the flow waveform, it starts off with a constant flow. So at least at the beginning of inspiration, we see constant flows has to be volume control. We also see that the inspiration is time cycled with an inspiratory pause. So constant flow and time cycling, that's volume control. Now, the question of the ventilatory pattern, are these all mandatory breaths or are these mandatory breaths with spontaneous breaths? Well, it looks to me like every single inspiratory time is the same. They're all volume controlled, and you can't have a volume controlled spontaneous breath. So I wouldn't say this is IMV, I'd say this is CMV. So far, so good?
Yeah, go at it.
And then, as pointed out, there's that little bump at the end.
What did I do? Sorry. There, go.
So we have a constant flow, and then and you get a slight increase in flow just before the inspiratory hold. And you can imagine if you look straight up, you get a slight depression in the pressure waveform. And that would indicate to me that this probably is some form of dual targeting, because otherwise it would have to be a preset waveform that looked squirrely like that, and I've never heard of such a thing. So I suggest that this is indeed dual targeting with a small, sort of a reverse trigger kind of inspiratory effort. So you would probably call this an early trigger. And it just gives a very small flow augmentation and then immediately goes into an inspiratory hold without any distortion. So I think it's just a small effort that happens right in the middle, apparently. What do you think?
Yeah, this one, that's so actually I'm gonna put here, this is gonna be kind of cool. So Rob's take is that this is VC CMB with dual, and this is triggered by PMOS, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because this is a deep. The comment that came in the internet was, well, so if you notice, this patient is here at 500 of tidal volume set with a PEEP of 10. And this was interpreted, or the question was, is this the stress index is a marker of, and then they dropped the tidal volume to 400, and they went up on the PEEP, and that finding went away. It disappeared, or I cannot see it anymore, at least on this waveform. I'm gonna make it big for all of you. It's gone. So I don't, if Ariel, if he has connected, Angelo, that would be good, because the question is, was this patient paralyzed? That was immediately what I thought, is this patient paralyzed? Because otherwise this has to be dual with presence of PMOS, but it's a tiny PMOS, like a little that we don't see any deflection actually during the inspiratory hold pause, right? It's super consistent, one after the other, and it activates the flow. I think a man had a very, wise, it says it's either PMOS or there's something going on with this ventilator. It's a malfunction, but the change with the PEEP, I could not explain that. The key message in general that I would say when I see these waveforms is, if there is a change in the flow, you cannot estimate the stress index on this waveform, because then it's gonna change the waveform, the pressure waveform, and it will give actually a false finding for your stress index. So it has to be a square wave flow waveform. So
Yeah, exactly. The bump in pressure has to be coming from the bump in flow.
right. So if anything, so there, the leading theory in my mind is that this is potentially an early trigger, as you alluded to. Now I went, and I thank you, Rob. You helped me out with finding this manual, and we found the manual for the Mindray Vent B300, and it's pretty scant. I mean, the amount of information that it has is very, very low, but they have this image that caught my attention, because they talk about, these are the typical waveforms on volume AC mode. Pmax stands for high alarm limit of airway pressure. And so you can see here a passive breath with the inspiratory time and inspiratory pause. Then the next one is the other type of application of dual targeting, in which actually the ventilator starts with a a constant flow, so volume controlled, but it reached a Pmax level, which under these circumstances they put -5, which I presume is 5 below the Pmax limit. And under those circumstances, it changes from from volume control to pressure control, but it changes because of a Pmax limit. And then the breath continues and ends. And then the next one is the patient that reaches a Pmax and it cycles off. And so you have that's a early cycle due to a pressure limit. But it doesn't have, Rob, here you can see that there's effort on this patient and they don't have any little caricature about it activating the dual targeting under those circumstances.
Yeah, well, GE didn't either, right?
Right. So
manufacturers don't always claim, they don't always explain what they do like Servo does.
right. So this is one of those situations in which it's hard for us to determine what it is unless you grab the ventilator and start doing some interventions with it. You put it on a test volume, test lung, and then just make it inflate and see if it's changing the flow waveform and turning into it. And under those circumstances, it would be dual. Questions from the team? Comments?
My only comment, go back to that slide there with the Pmax on it. There's two kinds of Pmaxes here, which is confusing. The second one is a pressure limit, and the third one is a pressure cycle. They're calling them both Pmax. It's very confusing.
I think that the key is this -5 that they.
That could be, yeah.
Yeah.
Could be.
But I mean, this is a little bit of cheating, right? They have to give us a little bit better information on the data. All righty, team. I appreciate everybody joining. Here is the CME code for the CCF caregivers. Here is the SEVA webpage for those of you that want to log in and see much more in the future. These are our Twitter handles. This is my email. Send me whatever images you want. Thank you to the fellows. Thank you, Mariam and Samid for Mariam Saeed and Mohammed Samid for joining and helping us read these waveforms. I really appreciate it. Great job.